A very warm welcome to you if you've just joined us. We are coming to you live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. This is the Week in Review. Of course, it is the program where we review some of the big stories to come out of the week and what has been making headlines, getting South Africans talking. Now, I'm your host, Liesl Wilson. Let's take a look at your headlines before we delve into your top stories for today. Well, government moves up the meeting of the National Coronavirus Command Council to sit today, sparking rumours of an imminent hard lockdown. Australia and Thailand have joined a growing list of governments rushing to restrict travelling from southern African countries to try to contain the new coronavirus variant. Chairperson of the National AIDS Council, David Mabuza, engages with traditional leaders and interfaith leaders on the active participation in response to HIV and AIDS, TB, STIs, and the COVID-19 vaccination program. Well, as we look at your headlines for today, let's get into your top story. President Cyril Ramaphosa will convene the National Coronavirus Command Council today to discuss the way forward in light of the detection of the new COVID-19 variant in the country and the rising number of new cases. The meeting will assess developments in the COVID-19 pandemic, including scientific updates on the new B.1.1.529 variant. The World Health Organization last night declared the strain, also called the Omicron variant, a variant of concern after an emergency meeting. Countries across the world are toughening restrictions to contain the spread of the variant. Our Minister in the Presidency, Mondi Gungubele says the detection of the new variant demonstrates the country's constant vigilance and scientific capability in the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Minister has urged South Africans to be vigilant, follow COVID-19 protocols and get vaccinated. The COVID-19 positivity rate has jumped to 9.1%. That's only 2 days after the announcement that a new variant was detected in the country. The National Institute for Communicable Diseases says of the almost 31,000 tests done in the last 24 hours, 2,828 were positive. The positivity rate should be less than 5% for the pandemic to be considered under control. A further 12 COVID-19 related deaths have also been recorded. It brings the total number of fatalities to 89,783. Well, 2,173 of the new cases are found in Gauteng. Meanwhile, Health Minister Dr. Joe Phaahla says there's no evidence that vaccines are ineffective against the new COVID-19 variant. Phaahla was speaking during a virtual briefing in response to the discovery of the B.1.1.529 strain, or Omicron variant. Now, he says the decision by some countries to impose a travel ban on travellers from South Africa is unfair.
This is very early stages in terms of, the specifics of how this new variant is going to unfold. Now, that's why we are saying that the reaction of some of countries in terms of imposing travel bans and such measures are completely against the norms and standards as guided by the World Health Organization. At this stage, therefore, as South Africa, we want to assure South Africans that it's very necessary that, as we have been warned even earlier when this pandemic started, that we must do everything to protect ourselves in terms of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, but also that it has been proven over time that the vaccines which have been approved by various bodies, world bodies, including the World Health Organization, but also various regulators, reputable regulators, including our own regulator, the SAPRA, which is indeed very, very vigilant before they can approve any vaccines, that we were quite confident at this stage that the vaccines remain a major bulwark in terms of protecting us against these viruses.
Right, for more on this, let's bring in Professor Mosamo Shabela, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Innovation at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. I dare say good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on the Week in Review today.
Good afternoon to you, Lizel, and to the viewers. Thank you for inviting me.
Prof, Omicron coronavirus variant, recently identified in South Africa, has virologists and health authorities on edge because of the many mutations. Can you unpack what the latest regarding this variant is emerging? Why has Omicron been named a variant of concern this time around?
Yeah, Lizel, we've received a lot of information this week, and we are processing this information really fast. Even for the public, I guess it's the same because we are getting information as things unfold. But I think the essence of it is that, we have now come to an understanding that, yes, there is this new variant, and this new variant has got multiple mutations, and the possible combination of those mutations are concerning. And the World Health Organization met yesterday to essentially review the data presented by South Africa and Botswana and others who had information on the variant. And as you correctly said, they have now designated a variant of concern. And so far up to this point, we know that variants like Delta and Alpha and also Beta have been designated variants of concern. And there is because of three properties. One is that if a variant is potentially highly transmissible, like Delta was, it's a problem. Secondly, if a variant can evade immunity, and to some extent, the Beta variant that was identified a year ago in South Africa had those properties. And finally, if potentially a variant can cause severe disease. Otherwise, if the variant does not necessarily, meet some of these properties or show signs of meeting these properties, it would be labeled a variant of interest. If it's labeled a variant of concern, it means that the World Health Organization task team that reviewed this, which is an independent body of scientists globally, are taking seriously the data that has been presented to them. And I think that we should also do the same.
So, Prof, as research continues and obviously testing is underway, there have been some concerns about reports surrounding young people being admitted. Is this due to the vaccination, to lack of being vaccinated, or the mutation itself? What reasons are being put forth? And in the same breath, what age groups are of concern this time round?
Yeah, indeed. I think that one of the things that we have to understand, the research currently is essentially looking at whether the variant is transmissible or it's escaping immunity, which means that it could reduce effectiveness of vaccines. But the other question that often bothers us is whether this variant is going to cause severe disease, especially among people who are unvaccinated. And the pattern we are seeing currently, and this is largely anecdotal reports on the ground, is that most of the people that are being admitted are young people. And we know that the vaccination rate in the young people between 18 and 34, who are also the people that seem to be the most that are diagnosed currently in the current clusters of outbreaks that we have seen, are the ones who are admitted, and they seem to be the ones that are dominating the infections so far, especially in Gauteng. This basically raises concerns about whether this has to do with the fact that only 25% of them are vaccinated, or whether there are changes to the clinical properties or behaviors of this variant. So I would say to you that we need a little bit more time, maybe another week or two, to observe the clinical course of disease, to be able to come to some conclusions around the clinical severity. But the data so far actually just indicates that it's important that we increase the number of young people that are vaccinated.
Prof, in the same breath, there have been concerns regarding or surrounding ignorance and even, various forms of discrimination, which seems to dominate largely seen in the narratives and in the modes of reporting and just some of the information that is coming through, again, that being under the spotlight. So we're looking at the crediting of our researchers, the vast, the impact that they've had, their commitment, their expertise in detecting Omicron. But it seems that we're being punished for these revelations. What's also emerging on that front? How important is it to be aware of the dissemination of the correct information at this point?
Yeah, Lizel, I think we have to be clear about a couple of things. One is that making information available and being transparent about it as it emerges is the right thing to do, especially in a pandemic. And this is because there's no time to waste. You waste a day, it can result in several people being infected, and some people may die because you've wasted a day. And we said the same thing back at the end of, in 2020, at the beginning of 2020, when we were looking at the responses of the Chinese government, for example. We wanted to make sure that as soon as they picked up the signs in December, they reported immediately instead of sitting on it. And this issue of reporting, really, it's important. We have to encourage reporting. If we then respond with fear because, countries are feeling vulnerable, it can discourage other countries from being transparent and reporting immediately. And this will not help us in our fight against the pandemic. So we have to be clear about that. At the same time, I think that we understand that even those countries, whenever they identify these public health threats and risks, they need to act immediately. But that action does not necessarily include penalizing specific countries. They need to tighten their controls because they've been alerted, but not necessarily to penalize countries that are, providing information. This will become a disincentive for many other countries.
Well, we've seen the US restricting travel from South Africa and several other Southern African countries to try to stop or contain the spread of Omicron. It also follows a similar flight plan imposed by the EU and the UK. The question is this a form of scapegoating?
I wouldn't call it scapegoating per se, but certainly I think that it does not necessarily align very well with the public health responses. They justify it from a public health perspective. But if you think about how the virus spreads, we do not necessarily think that the virus is only in South Africa and Southern African countries are surrounding South Africa. These viruses are already in many other countries. This is the nature of the spread, which is why it's a global problem, a pandemic. So if you now respond by penalizing or stopping flights from a specific country, then you are not necessarily responding from a public health perspective. What's important is to tighten your borders, especially in the short term. And whatever flights are coming from those countries, people need to be quarantined, tested, sequenced, to make sure that you can control it. What Hong Kong did in identifying the variant and the measures that they took, I think those were good public health measures, but not necessarily to suddenly stop flights. They caused disruption in people's lives at a time when there's already anxiety and panic, and then people overcrowd, and then you continue to spread. You quarantine people for many hours in a flight, in a plane, you're causing problems. And then I won't even mention the issues around livelihoods as well as the economy. So you have to really be responsible and scientific, systematic in the way one implements measures, not from fear and knee-jerk, but really be rational.
So, Prof, as the President convenes with the National Coronavirus Command Council, ultimately what should South Africa be doing about this new variant and the proposed measures set to be put in place very soon?
Yeah, I think that South Africa needs to act really fast. I think that one of the things that I think is important is that we know that vaccination helps in as much as many people in South Africa have been reluctant to take vaccines. This is not a time to politicize the issue and to contest with sort of anti-vaxxer issues. A lot is at stake and it will be too late if we wait to vaccinate. So that we have to do. And in fact, South Africa should consider some sort of mandatory vaccination as a policy nationally, in my view. The second thing is that we know the measures that work, the mask, the distancing, the ventilation, avoiding crowded spaces, and these measures are going to help protect people from spreading the virus. If people are going to be exposed, they need to test, they need to trace and contact their contacts and speak to them and notify them, and also make sure that their contacts are quarantined. In the long run, I do think that South Africa needs to make sure that we can actually act quickly to contain the spread in the areas, especially, epicenter, but also recognize that the virus can already be in other provinces. If we don't act quickly, it will be too late. I don't necessarily think that we need to panic and respond with fear. I think that we need to be as rational as possible.
All right, Prof, thank you very much for joining us, leaving the conversation there for now. World Health Organization last night declaring the strain Omicron variant a variant of concern after an emergency meeting where countries across the world are toughening restrictions to contain the spread of the Omicron variant. Again, President Cyril Ramaphosa will convene the National Coronavirus Command Council today to discuss the way forward in light of the detection of the new COVID-19 variant in the country and the rising number of new cases. Again, thank you very much to Professor Mosomo Shabela, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We're going to take a quick ad break. We take a look at more stories that made headlines this week on the other side. Professor Sipho Siepe joins us for that discussion. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Right, welcome back. You are tuned into the Week in Review with myself, Liesl Wilson. More news at this hour. The Democratic Alliance says it will not be dependent or be dictated to by the EFF and how to run municipalities. This comes as the EFF and Action SA helped install DA mayors in Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni and Tshwane, amongst others, as they voted against the ANC. These comments were made as the party's top brass unveiled its newly elected mayors for metros and municipalities across the country. Well, SABC News reporter Natasha Peary filed this report.
Over 20 newly elected DA mayors from across all 9 provinces were presented by the party's leadership at Nkululeko House, east of Johannesburg. Earlier this week, the ANC was ousted in several municipalities as the DA took up mayoral chains with the aid of Action SA and the EFF. On Thursday, EFF leader Julius Malema said their vote for the DA was a vote against the ANC. He further claimed that he foiled an agreement between Helen Zille and ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa that planned to retain certain municipalities under the rule of the ANC. Zille has poured cold water over these claims and says they will not be dependent on the Red Berets in council.
He doesn't want to be in government. He wants to control the officials, their decisions, the tenders and contracts and the policies that are applied in government. And so he says, appoint this person as your municipal manager. Give this tender to this company. Ensure that you follow this policy. And if you don't, we will withdraw our support and your government will fall. And that is not the kind of relationship we envisage. And that is why, through the course of these negotiations, we were absolutely plain. And we said, we are prepared to be in opposition. We are not prepared to sell our souls. And it was that tough line that had the very unintended consequence of the people against whom we took the tough line actually voting for us and putting us into government.
Party leader John Steenhuisen says the party is still continuing with coalition talks. Earlier this week, Action SA leader Herman Mashaba vowed that they will not go into further coalition talks with the DA without Malema and has urged the DA to demonstrate the same level of maturity shown to them by the multi-party coalition group and resume negotiations that put the interests of the residents first.
I also want to point out that our talks with other parties that haven't signed the coalition agreements are still ongoing. We're reaching out to these parties in good faith and with humility as we try to establish majority coalitions in these hung councils.
Meanwhile, the various mayors have outlined their plans of making the municipalities they govern in a better place. Newly elected Executive Mayor of the City of Johannesburg, Dr. Mpho Phalatse, says she wants to put a moratorium on the filling of vacancies and extension of contracts until there is proper executive oversight in place. Ekurhuleni Mayor committed herself to delivering basic services to all communities in the city.
To stick to turnaround times when there is electricity outage, when there is a burst water pipe, when there is a sewage spill.
By working very hard over the coming years, and that work has started already, to end load shedding in Cape Town, to be the first place in the country that is free of load shedding.
Steenhuisen further urged the DA mayors to work on strengthening coalitions within their respective municipalities. Natasha Piri, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, for more on this and other political stories that made headlines this week, we're joined now by political analyst, Professor Sipho Siepe. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Week in Review today.
Good afternoon.
Prof, could you perhaps, unpack the political decisions behind the coalitions we've seen emerging? How do these formed coalitions serve the people that went out and actually voted for these parties?
Well, first of all, we must accept that the coalitions occur because of the will of the people. If the people had felt that there is a party that they can trust with the outright majority, they will have done so. So effectively, the coalitions are imposed by the people to South Africans in the sense that says, you guys must work together. But coming to how the coalitions come about will be informed by the party's interest. The DA was very clear about who it would not work with. And so was the position of the EFF. The ANC was one that was willing to work with anybody. But for both the EFF and the DA and other parties, they felt that the ANC had been punished. So to return it to government would be undermining the will of the people. So you saw a ganging up against the ANC. But for this coalition to work, there was also from the EFF side, the ANC could easily have worked with the EFF, it could easily have worked with the DA. But I think the factional battles within the ANC made it very difficult for it to work first with the EFF, because if you work with the EFF was very clear that if you work with us, you must first respect your own resolutions, which we agree to. Those were conference resolutions that were part of the radical posture that the ANC had taken at that conference. But the ANC leadership at the moment had abandoned that radical posture. At the same time, to work with the DA, it will send a wrong message. But the DA was very clear that to bring a party that is lost, that had been in government for a number of years, would be undermining the will of the people. Hence, it was willing to partner with anybody. But at the same time, it was very clear that that partnership will not be where the other party is going to dictate on the agenda of the DA. So the EFF decided that even though it will not partner with the DA, it will simply support the DA to lead. And this is what people need to understand, that there is no coalition between the EFF and the DA. And the DA was very clear about that. But the Malema was also very clear that this election's outcome must count for something. And if it means punishing the ANC, so be it. So the ANC is out of power. But for the coalition to succeed, they need to go no further than going to Gauteng under Mashaba, because what Mashaba showed was the possibility of different groupings to work together. But you need to make sure of is that there must be terms of engagement, and there must be rules of that engagement, and they must also be able to deal with issues of deadlock breaking mechanism. But for the DA to be able to pass a budget, it has to pay attention to some of the concerns that come from smaller parties, that service delivery is sacrosanct, and servicing the poor who have been marginalized and remain marginalized even today after been 7 years is very important. So the DA does not seem to be opposed to that. Instead, it has always argued that where it governs, it does deliver. And the commitments that it is making to the people that will do better than what the ANC has actually done. So I think we are now on to a possibility where there might be a dialogue in this country. For a long time, what we've had has been more a grand positioning, political grandstanding, than putting the people in the center. And what the people have said to all the parties, that if you don't pay attention to us, we are going to punish you. We are going to, so what emerged out of this is a very good lesson that the ANC must pay attention to carefully, and all other parties must take as a good lesson to say, if you don't listen to the people, it doesn't matter whether you're a party of liberation, we will remove you from power.
Prof, before we get into the lessons learned and also the implications for the ruling party, I just want to go back to another point that you had alluded to, but perhaps also bringing in the fact that we heard DA Federal Council Chairperson Helen Zille saying the DA was very surprised that the EFF had voted with them in both Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni. I mean, how shocking was this move? And how do you think it's ultimately going to impact the political landscape moving forward, perhaps even as we edge towards 2024?
Well, the EFF has been very clear that it doesn't consider the DA to be a threat or a serious political opponent. It was formed after Malema and his group were expelled from the ANC. So their point of entry into any negotiation is that how does this advance the ANC? And if it does not advance the ANC, they're going to support it. So they entered these negotiations or positioning with the understanding that the ANC has had a lot of opportunities that where it took the voters for granted. So they will not participate in returning it. At the same time, they also know that the DA, because it lacks the majority, it will have to be forced to enter into negotiations with the EFF. And there are certain things that they can agree on and which should not be so much of a problem. One, the service delivery, provision of water, electricity, dealing with potholes are the things that the DA can say, we have done them. And I don't think the other parties like the EFF are actually opposed to that. So that is the posture that the coalition is going to, this new arrangement is going to take. But what will be very important is really that parties must put the people first. And only then, when you do that, then you are likely to be returned. And these parties are entering this, of course, looking at the 2024, because all of them, the EFF and the DA, are very clear that they want to make sure that come 2024, the ANC at the national level is also reduced. Its majority should be less than 50%. So they all have what they may consider, we may call a common enemy. But at the same time, they do so understanding that there are lessons to be learned, that you undermine the people will undermine you.
All right, so Prof, in the same breath then, when we look at the ruling party and perhaps how the outcomes relate to its electoral strategy and also its failure to negotiate itself into power, what are the implications of the coalitions formed for the ruling party going into 2024?
Well, the first thing that the ruling party must stop, it must stop believing its own propaganda. One of the things that it had said to everybody is that they are going to field Ramaphosa and he is going to be the face of the ANC because he's more popular than the ANC. What we saw on the ground is exactly the opposite. Wherever Ramaphosa went, especially historically in black townships, he was being booed. So he may be popular in white spaces, but where the vote matters, which is in the majority townships where the ANC has always gained more support, what we saw is people rejecting him. So the ANC needs to stop believing that its own propaganda around that. Secondly, it needs to forgo the idea that it is a leader of society. Yes, it may have gotten more votes than other parties, but there is a clear message that is emerging from the electorate. And I would say also, for most people who used to vote for the ANC and have chosen, it's been something very painful. So they've decided to say, we are not going to support this party, especially under this administration. Because if Ramaphosa was doing very well, better than previous presidents, we should have seen at least more support. But instead, we've seen the ANC going down the drain. So the sooner they accept that the propaganda and the electoral strategy has not worked, the better. Then moving forward is they need to simply say, and which is what they're saying now, that they cannot be party to destabilization of governments, especially at the municipal level, because the people are also looking at your commitment to democracy must also be measured by your response to when you lose. If you're going to be a destabilizing force because you have lost, then you're not a Democrat. So I think how the ANC behaves at the moment will determine its commitment to democracy, will also determine how it will do in 2024.
All right, Prof, just in the interest of time, I want to perhaps steer away from the chat about coalitions and move on to the Q&A session that, of course, the President underwent in Parliament this week. Eskom was a major talking point for the President, where he highlighted how the restructuring of Eskom is also going to transform the sector and enable greater competition and investment just in relation to new generation capacity. I mean, what do you make of this at large?
Well, the president has not said anything new. One must remember that in 2015, it was the same president who had promised that the challenges at Eskom, because he was given that responsibility as the leader of government business to deal with the SOEs. He failed then. When he took over in 2018, he made these promises. 2019, he made the promises. As we were going towards election, the promises were being made. So people are used to all these promises. But what is very clear is that Eskom at the moment is either poorly managed or is not sustainable. And what we know is load shedding, and the president also acknowledges that load shedding is going to continue. And some people like Matashi have actually suggested that the ANC was punished because of the failure of Eskom. So the promises by the president mean nothing to the majority. They've had them before. It is only when you start having people who are very, very capable. Remember, this not so long ago, the president said our problems with Eskom had to do with what happened in Zambia. But what the president was saying is simply what he was told by management at Eskom. But there is no relationship on what happens in Zambia with our electricity. So one must understand that it is better for the president to say less about the promise that he had made that had not materialized. And this is also one of the reasons why the ANC is punished. It is punished because it makes a lot of promises that it cannot deliver on.
All right, Prof. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Of course, a lot happening this week. I want to thank you very much for your time. Prof. Sipho CF, again, political analyst, joining us for a look at some of the big stories emerging on the news front for this week. Again, thank you for your time. Let's take a quick ad break. On the other side, we're going to be chatting about Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta's visit to the country recently. All this on the other side. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. This is the Week in Review. We continue with our top stories making headlines this week. In fact, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta has recently visited South Africa, where during his visit, he made a stop at the Aspen Farm Care in Gqeberha in the Eastern Cape, and also at the Transnet Kurusport engineering site. For more on this, we're joined by Dr. Kinsley Makubela, former South African ambassador to Kenya, and he joins us via Zoom. Dr. Kinsley, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on the Week in Review.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for the opportunity this time.
Let's start off with the visit by President Kenyatta. I mean, it comes after the Africa Intra-Trade in Durban. Can we see this as a continuation of strengthening relationships between the two countries?
Well, the visit, a state visit is usually a ceremonial and a pomp event. But this visit comes at a time when there are two critical developments in the region. The conflict in Mozambique, what transpired last week in Uganda, and of course the economic development and the conflict that is raging in Ethiopia. So all those issues are framing the visit by President Uhuru Kenyatta.
Well, as we look at some of those issues, I want to perhaps hone in on some of the top talking points that came through the visit this week. I mean, now that the trip has taken place, what are some of those things that have come out which will perhaps help strengthen the ties between the two countries, perhaps before we look at some of the other dynamics on the continent as well?
The security cooperation is very fundamental that came out during the meeting. You would have realized at the press conference, President Ramaphosa saying that we are ready for insurgents that may likely attack us. He was speaking from experience, given the fact that Kenya has been in the front line of these insurgents. And recently we've seen around the world how these insurgents work. they go and look for soft targets back home. And I think this visit by Kenya, probably definitely at the head of state level, they must have shared information about how to manage that. And given the fact that we are involved now in Mozambique to deal with almost the same insurgent. But this comes at a time when the conflict in Ethiopia is also raging. And I think the two heads of state did share ideas in terms of contributing to the solution of the conflict. Remember, Ethiopia is the biggest economy in the IGAD area. I think they have about the GDP of $107 billion, somewhere there. And it has been a leading force in IGAD. So the absence of active Ethiopia in the economic development of the IGAD area and the relationship with the SADC area, and by extension with South Africa, has serious ramification in terms of the integration of the African continent. So those issues form the base of the discussion. Notwithstanding, of course, issues related to bilateral relations, trade between South Africa and Kenya. So those are the issues really that came out for discussion. And from where I am sitting, because I've really spent considerable time doing analysis and really looking at the conflict in the Horn of Africa, I think this visit came at a critical time where we needed to learn more about how do we deal with this kind of activities. When you go and defend in a foreign country, you are open for attack at home. And I think I'm glad to hear the president saying that we are ready for this kind of insurgent. But Lisa, don't forget, there's a firm ground now in terms of the taking over by the Taliban in Afghanistan. We don't know what kind of contribution it would have in the global insecurity, because Afghanistan has been a beehive of conflict. A lot of Somali leaders, during my experience and interaction with Somalis, some of them have trained in Afghanistan. So would it become a training ground for new insurgents around the world? So surely these are issues that I think at the heads of state, they must have exchanged dynamic information as to how do we manage this global changing situation.
Absolutely. Dr. Kinsey, you've spoken about Pan-African integration. I want to perhaps look at the economic prospects as well. Obviously, looking at the imbalances perhaps of trade between South Africa and Kenya, and even just leveraging off the opportunities that could be utilized to balance the scale between the two countries. I mean, we also heard President Ramaphosa saying that more than 40 South African companies have invested in the Kenyan market in the past 2 decades. I mean, are we likely to see this number increase in the future?
I think there are, since my time even in Kenya, I realized during this discussion, some of these issues are still at the core of the challenge between the two countries. The tariffs and the non-tariff barriers that exist. When I was in Kenya, South African Brewery had a big plant in Thika. But there were non-tariff barriers that really compelled South African breweries to leave Kenya. And ironically, South African breweries left at the time that they were entering into an agreement with to create the biggest brewer in the world. So there are challenges related to that. And some of my colleagues from Kenya were saying to me, there are South African companies that are investing, after a year or two, they leave the country. I mean, they were mentioning Massmart that has moved into Kenyan market and it's given a notice to close some of their stores, including Builders Warehouse and so on. Now, the challenges related to that are the non-tariff barriers that needed to be managed. And then during my time in Kenya, you know, the Kenyan brewery had a slogan that used to say, Tusker my beer, Kenya my country. Very nationalistic and really trying to push South African breweries out. Having said that, the trade between South Africa and Kenya is skewed in favor of South Africa. I mean, we're not importing a lot, we're exporting a lot to Kenya. I think the biggest variant that we are exporting is iron and steel, which takes about $92 million. And that's really nothing in the bigger scheme of things and giving the importance of the Kenyan economy in the IGAD area and the East African area. So there is a space really for more trade. The Kenyans have been complaining that they have no access to South African market. And I think some of the challenges they must have been addressed during this discussion, because if we don't address those non-tariff barriers, trade between the two countries will not be realized.
So you've touched on some of the barriers to entry, perhaps on both sides. But President Uhuru also coming out to say, or preaching rather, about unity in Africa. I wonder, in your opinion, if this does in fact become a reality, just also given the ripple effects of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and other, talks in place. Can the continent become a manufacturing giant at this point, given the geopolitical dynamics? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. The continent can integrate. Remember, the AU took a decision at the inception, at the formation of the AU from the Organization of the African Unity, that they are building blocks for African integration. And those building blocks are RECs, the regional economic blocks. Now, we need to deal with the regional economic blocks because at that level, that's where you find a lot of stumbling blocks in terms of the integration. And if we deal with those issues, they would address the broader issues that are contained in the free trade agreement that was signed sometimes during the course of this year by African heads of state. But you're going to find that at the regional level, if those issues are not dealt with in ECOWAS, you're going to find challenges. For instance, I know in the SADC area, Kenya has been very interested to export soda ash, which is a product that you use to make glasses and so on. But Malawi is the biggest producer of soda ash in the area, and Malawi is very protective of that. So these are issues that really need to be discussed at the regional integration level because it would create a better environment to integrate at the continental level, because having an agreement that says there must be free trade agreement without these building blocks functioning optimally, we're going to have challenges in terms of this integration.
Dr. Kingsley, so much more to unpack, but I want to thank you very much for your time. Just today, in fact, Dr. Kingsley Makubela, just former South African ambassador to Kenya, again chatting about President Uhuru Kenyatta's visit, a recent visit to South Africa, perhaps what emerged and what are some of the barriers to entry and also ways which can be forged ahead as the country improves its bilateral relations between the two. And that's where we're going to leave the show today. Once again, it has been an absolute pleasure from myself, Liesl Wilson, and the team. Do take care. We'll be back tomorrow for a look at the week ahead. Goodbye for now.